Hi guys, welcome to Serially Drowsy. Tonight I will go over Victorian-era mental asylums and treatment of mental health. We will look at what the general beliefs on mental health were, how they treated it, and what the conditions were like inside these places of care, all done in a calm and relaxing voice, while staying true to history. So lay back, close your eyes if you need to, and drift away in these stories. And if you do enjoy this style of videos, consider subscribing for more like it, as it does help my channel out, and let me know where you're watching from. Imagine stepping back in time to the late 1800s. The streets are narrow, fog lingers in the air, and horse-drawn carriages rattle along cobblestones. But your destination is not the bustling market square, or even the church at the heart of town. No. You are being led through towering iron gates, past ivy-covered brick walls that loom like a fortress. You have arrived at a Victorian insane asylum. From the outside, it might resemble a grand estate, with turrets and long rows of windows. But inside, behind locked doors and barred windows, the reality was far less noble. The asylum was both a place of hope and a place of despair. Families brought their loved ones here in desperation, convinced that doctors held the key to curing their madness. Others, however, used these institutions as a way to hide away embarrassments of the household. Women deemed too emotional, men who had lost their jobs, orphans with nowhere else to go. The Victorian era was a time of contradictions. Science was advancing rapidly, an age of discovery, electricity, and industrial progress. But mental health remained a murky frontier. Madness was feared, misunderstood, and often moralized. Many believed insanity was the result of sin, bad blood, or even divine punishment. And so, stepping inside a Victorian asylum was stepping into a world shaped as much by superstition and social prejudice as by medicine. The asylum was not always the first choice for care. Before the Victorian age, the mentally ill were often kept at home, chained in basements or confined in poorhouses alongside criminals and beggars. But as cities grew, so too did the number of people deemed mad. By the early 19th century, reformers pushed for large institutions dedicated solely to mental illness. They argued that a structured environment could restore order to disordered minds. This idea became known as moral treatment, a belief that routine, discipline, and calm surroundings could help heal. Thus, massive asylums were built across Britain, Europe, and America. The architecture itself reflected the philosophy: sprawling grounds with long corridors, high windows to let in light, and gardens for restful walks. These institutions were meant to be self-contained worlds where patients lived, worked, prayed, and died, all under one roof. Life inside these walls depended entirely on why you were admitted. The definition of insanity was shockingly broad. Women might be committed for hysteria, a catch-all term for emotional distress, grief, or even dissatisfaction with marriage. Men were often admitted for melancholia, after losing jobs or falling into alcoholism. Children could be confined for epilepsy, which at the time was considered a mental defect. Doctors also listed causes that today would sound absurd: masturbation, religious excitement, reading too many novels, or over-education. Families, too, wielded enormous power. A husband could send his wife to an asylum with little resistance, citing her instability. Once inside, the odds of release were slim. If you found yourself entering such a place, your possessions would be taken, and your hair often cut short for hygiene. Uniforms were issued, coarse, simple clothing that stripped away individuality. Some asylums prided themselves on separating patients by class. Wealthier inmates were given private rooms and access to parlours, while the poor slept in crowded wards, sometimes shoulder to shoulder on straw mattresses. The day began early. Bells rang to wake patients, meals were simple and repetitive, and work was mandatory for many. The idea was that labour could restore discipline. Men might toil in fields or workshops, while women sewed linens or helped in the laundry. On the surface, this looked like therapy. In practice, it was often cheap labour that kept the asylum running. This was the world of the Victorian asylum, part hospital, part prison, part factory. For some, it represented hope, structured care, clean surroundings, an escape from the chaos of life outside. For others, it was a nightmare of confinement, abuse, and stigma. And so, in this story, we will walk through its gates and follow what a single day might look like inside. We will explore the medical theories, the treatments, many cruel by modern standards, the doctor's strange beliefs, and the haunting reality faced by the thousands who lived and died in these institutions. Because once you stepped inside those iron gates, it wasn't just your freedom that was lost. It was your identity, your dignity, and sometimes your very life. If you had the misfortune of waking up inside a Victorian asylum, your day began not with a sunrise of freedom, but with the clanging of bells echoing through stone corridors. The sound carried with it an unmistakable message: order and discipline. Patients were expected to rise early, long before warmth touched the grounds outside. The asylum was not a place for leisure. It was a machine, and you were one of its cogs. Breakfast was simple, often uninspired. A hunk of bread, porridge thinned with water, or occasionally tea that was more bitter than comforting. Lunch and dinner were hardly better. Broths with floating scraps of vegetables, small cuts of meat when supplies permitted, and potatoes, lots of potatoes. The wealthy inmates who could pay extra for their keep sometimes dined separately, with slightly fresher ingredients and the occasional luxury like butter or jam. But for the majority, food was fuel, not pleasure. Doctors believed that plain diets promoted calmness, discouraging excitement of the mind. Rich, flavorful foods were thought dangerous, encouraging passions and worsening insanity. So blandness became a prescription as much as the pills or tonics later introduced. Malnutrition wasn't uncommon, and the thin, weary faces of patients reflected more than just their mental struggles. It showed the slow erosion of the body itself. After meals, many patients were sent to work. For men, this might mean labour in the asylum's fields, chopping wood or repairing buildings. For women, the laundry was an endless, steaming prison. Clothing for hundreds of inmates, linens for the infirmary and the uniforms themselves, all scrubbed by hand, day after day. Others were assigned to sewing, scrubbing floors, or kitchen duty. The philosophy behind this was known as occupational therapy. Doctors claimed that work restored discipline and gave structure to wandering minds. But the reality was far more practical. The asylum was a self-sustaining ecosystem. Patients provided the labour that kept it running, reducing costs for the state and ensuring that the institution could feed itself. This blurred line between therapy and exploitation was rarely questioned. After all, what better way to enforce order than to occupy restless hands with endless, repetitive tasks? For the doctors and wardens, it was efficiency. For patients, it was exhaustion disguised as medicine. The asylum was a place of order, and that order extended to how patients were separated. Men and women were almost always housed in separate wings, with little chance of contact. Privacy was a luxury they would never see. Patients were also divided by the severity of their illness, or at least what doctors perceived as severity. Quiet patients, those who could work or follow instructions, were placed in more comfortable areas. The violent or raving were kept under stricter watch, sometimes locked in isolation or restrained for much of the day. It was not uncommon for wards to carry haunting names: the incurables, the idiots, or the dangerous. Labels were destiny inside the asylum. Once assigned, they were difficult to escape, shaping the treatment or mistreatment a patient could expect. Routine was everything. Bells signalled rising, meals, work, prayer, and bed. Even free time was carefully monitored. Patients might be allowed to stroll through gardens under watchful eyes, or attend chapel services, where religion was seen as another form of cure. Doctors and wardens believed that a strictly ordered life could restore balance to the disordered mind. But this order often veered into oppression. Talking out of turn could result in punishment. Refusing to work or breaking rules could mean days in solitary confinement, strapped into restraining devices, or denied meals. The asylum was not just a hospital, it was also a moral institution, enforcing Victorian ideals of discipline, obedience, and quiet submission. Beyond the daily routine, the sensory experience of the asylum left its own scars. The smell of unwashed bodies lingered in crowded dormitories, mixed with the stench of chamber pots and disinfectants. Corridors echoed with shouts, screams, prayers, and sobbing. For newcomers, it was overwhelming, a cacophony of suffering that stripped away the illusion of recovery and replaced it with despair. And yet, there were moments of eerie silence. A ward could fall still as patients sat motionless, rocking quietly, or staring blankly at the walls. The silence was often more unsettling than the noise, a reminder of the hollowed-out lives contained within these walls. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of daily life was the monotony. Days blended into weeks, weeks into years. Few patients ever knew how long they would remain. Release was rare, and for many the asylum became the world, the only world they would ever know. Time itself felt distorted, suspended. Without freedom, individuality, or hope of leaving, patients often surrendered to the routine, becoming shadows of themselves. The system was designed to instill calm, but in doing so, it extinguished vitality. It was a life that many entered against their will and few ever escaped. And while reformers argued that these places offered hope for the people inside, each day was a battle against despair. The Victorian asylum wasn't simply a place to confine the mentally ill. It was also a laboratory, an experimental ground where doctors, often with more confidence than knowledge, attempted to cure what they barely understood. Treatments ranged from the bizarre to the barbaric, all under the guise of medicine. To step into the asylum as a patient meant exposing yourself not only to confinement, but also to a host of remedies that were often worse than the disease. Restraints were perhaps the most iconic and feared aspect of asylum life. Leather straps, iron manacles, straitjackets, and confinement chairs all had their place. The belief was simple: if a patient could not control themselves, the asylum would do it for them. Some doctors genuinely thought restraint provided comfort, like swaddling a restless infant. They claimed patients calmed when their limbs were bound. But for the person inside, it was often agony. Hours, or even days, spent tied tightly could cause swelling, sores, and infection. The most infamous device was the tranquilizer chair. Patients were strapped into a heavy wooden frame, sometimes with a hood placed over their head, limiting sight and sound. They might remain there for hours at a time, immobilized until their spirit was broken. It wasn't therapy, it was dominance disguised as care. To fully understand Victorian asylums, you have to go back centuries, to an idea so old it comes from the writings of Hippocrates and Galen. This was the humoral theory of medicine, a framework that claimed every illness, whether of the body or the mind, stemmed from an imbalance of 4 vital fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Though Victorian medicine was rapidly advancing with microscopes, anatomy, and early psychiatry, the ghost of the humours still lingered in the way doctors thought about madness. The theory went like this: too much blood made a person sanguine, cheerful, sociable, and energetic. Too much phlegm created a phlegmatic personality, slow, calm, and passive. An excess of black bile led to melancholy, sad, withdrawn, and prone to despair. Too much yellow bile made a person choleric, irritable, aggressive, and fiery. In the Victorian imagination, mental illness could be explained as nothing more than a humoral imbalance. Melancholia, for example, was often attributed to a literal surplus of black bile. Mania might be linked to overheated blood, while lethargy could be blamed on sluggish phlegm. Even as newer theories of the brain and nervous system emerged, asylum doctors still spoke in the language of humours. For them, the idea had a poetic neatness. Human nature could be mapped, categorized, and, most importantly, controlled. If the problem was an imbalance of fluids, then the solution was to restore balance. This thinking fueled many of the notorious treatments of the time. Bloodletting was still practiced in some asylums, though by the late 19th century it had declined. A patient in a manic state might have their veins opened to cool the blood. Purgatives and emetics, harsh laxatives or vomit-inducing medicines, were used to clear out supposed excess bile. The logic was brutal but simple. If black bile caused melancholy, then forcing the body to expel fluids could reset the mind. Diets were prescribed with humoral thinking in mind. A melancholic patient might be denied heavy meats, and instead given lighter foods thought to reduce bile. Temperature therapies, such as hot baths or cold plunges, were linked to balancing heat and cold within the body's fluids. To modern eyes, these treatments seem archaic, even cruel. But to the Victorian doctor, they were the rational application of centuries of medical wisdom. By the mid to late 1800s, humoral theory was officially outdated. Microscopy, pathology, and neurology had begun dismantling it. Yet, in practice, the language and assumptions of humours clung on in asylums. Even when alienists, early psychiatrists, spoke of nervous disorders, they often slipped back into humoral descriptions, framing patients as inherently sanguine, melancholic, or choleric types. For patients, this meant their suffering was often interpreted through a lens of bodily fluids, rather than psychological trauma or social conditions. A grieving widow might be labelled melancholic due to excess black bile, a restless child institutionalized for overheated blood. The endurance of the humoral system in Victorian asylums reveals something deeper, the desperate need for explanations. Madness terrified society, and the humours offered a simple, almost comforting story. It suggested mental illness wasn't random chaos. It was chemistry, imbalance, something a doctor could see and correct. Of course, it also meant countless patients endured leeches, purges, and dietary restrictions in the name of restoring balance. For many, their suffering only deepened, yet the theory of humours gave Victorian psychiatry a foundation to build upon, however flawed, and its shadow still lingers in how we talk about chemical imbalances today. Although fading by the late Victorian period, older traditions of medicine still lingered in many asylums. One such tradition was bloodletting. Mental illness was believed to stem from imbalances in the body's humours, so draining blood, or purging the body with powerful laxatives and emetics, was thought to restore balance. Patients already weakened by malnutrition or depression were bled further, leaving them pale, dizzy, and more fragile. Purges, meanwhile, caused violent vomiting and diarrhea, stripping the body of strength in the name of cleansing the mind. These practices often left patients more ill than before, but doctors recorded them as successes if the patient was too exhausted to resist. Water held a peculiar place in Victorian medical thought. Some doctors believed it soothed the mind, others used it as punishment. This gave rise to hydrotherapy, which could mean very different things depending on where you were confined. At its most benign, hydrotherapy meant long, tepid baths, where patients were submerged for hours under heavy blankets or strapped into tubs. Doctors claimed the water calmed nervous agitation and restored equilibrium. In practice, it often left patients numb, shivering, and miserable. At its cruelest, hydrotherapy meant cold showers. Ice-cold torrents poured over agitated patients to shock them into submission. Some were subjected to surprise baths, thrown suddenly into cold water as a disciplinary measure. The line between therapy and punishment was always thin, and water became both a tool of supposed healing and a weapon of control. Other treatments veered into outright cruelty. One common method was blistering, where irritant chemicals or heated instruments were applied to the skin to raise painful blisters. The theory was that drawing disease outward from the body might relieve the mind. Similarly, cauterization, burning small areas of the body, was used to distract patients from their delusions. The pain was thought to redirect mental energy, grounding the patient back in reality. Needless to say, it rarely worked, and often left permanent scars. By the late 19th century, experiments with electricity began creeping into asylums. Primitive shock therapies involved mild electric currents passed through the body. Though not as extreme as the electroconvulsive therapy of the 20th century, these early experiments were frightening and painful, more spectacle than science. Not all treatments were physical. Many asylums embraced moral therapy, a philosophy that mental illness could be cured by instilling discipline, morality, and proper behaviour. Patients were encouraged or forced to adopt middle-class Victorian values: obedience, cleanliness, piety, and hard work. Doctors prescribed prayer, scripture readings, and stern lectures as medicine for the soul. Those who conformed were praised as recovering. Those who resisted were punished. In theory, it was humane, avoiding whips and chains in favour of guidance. In practice, it often felt like another form of control, demanding conformity rather than genuine healing. By the late Victorian period, chemical remedies began to appear. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was widely prescribed to calm agitation or help with sleep. Bromides were introduced to reduce seizures and restlessness. Chloral hydrate, an early sedative, became another favourite. But these drugs were blunt instruments. Doses were poorly controlled, side effects poorly understood. Patients might be reduced to docile shells, not cured, but chemically silenced. Addiction was common, and long-term use could damage the body severely. Looking back, it is difficult to separate treatment from punishment. The line was blurred not just by cruelty, but by ignorance. Victorian doctors were working without modern neuroscience or psychiatry. They were groping in the dark, guided by superstition, outdated theories, and the cultural values of their time. Yet to the patients, intent mattered little. Whether it was a bleeding, a blister, or a cold bath, the result was often the same: suffering. What doctors called therapy, patients experienced as torment. The treatments of the Victorian asylum reveal the mindset of the age. To control the mind, doctors controlled the body. To calm the soul, they punished the flesh. And while some practices were carried out with genuine belief in their benefit, many were simply tools of power, maintaining order within walls that were more prison than hospital. This was the reality of cure in the 19th century, a blend of ignorance, cruelty, and the occasional flicker of genuine compassion. But if the treatments were harsh, the beliefs behind them were often stranger still. Victorian asylums were not simply collections of suffering patients. They were also theatres for the ambitions of doctors. Men who called themselves alienists, the early name for psychiatrists, derived from the belief that the mentally ill were alienated from their true selves, saw asylums as laboratories of the human mind. And while some sincerely sought understanding, many others became notorious for their bizarre theories, rigid moral views, and the sheer confidence with which they applied pseudoscience to human suffering. By the mid-19th century, medicine had begun to professionalize. The alienist emerged as a specialist, claiming authority over madness. Unlike general physicians, alienists studied behavior, speech, and mannerisms. They prided themselves on being able to diagnose not just illness of the body, but illness of the mind, something mysterious, invisible, and far harder to measure. Yet the field was plagued with contradictions. Some alienists argued insanity was hereditary, passed through tainted family lines like a curse. Others insisted it came from personal failings, laziness, indulgence, lack of morality. Few could agree, but nearly all cloaked their assumptions in the language of science, giving authority to what were often cultural prejudices. One of the most influential Victorian ideas was that of moral insanity. Coined by James Cowles Pritchard in 1835, it described patients who showed no intellectual impairment but seemed incapable of proper moral behaviour. A person might be clever, articulate and functional, yet dishonest, cruel or violent. To Victorians, this was evidence of madness, not a flawed character, but a diseased mind. This theory blurred the line between crime and illness. Was a thief mentally ill or simply wicked? Was a violent husband a product of madness or moral failing? Asylums became the answer, a place to send those whose behaviour threatened society, justified not as punishment, but as treatment. This dovetailed with the theory of degeneracy, popularised later in the century. Degeneracy suggested that mental illness was a sign of evolutionary decline, proof that a family line was rotting. The poor, the criminal, the alcoholic, and the mentally ill were lumped together as evidence of societal decay. In this worldview, asylums were not just hospitals, they were quarantines, protecting the healthy from contamination. Victorian medicine was captivated by phrenology, the study of skull shapes and bumps as indicators of character and mental health. Phrenologists believed the brain was divided into sections controlling specific traits, benevolence, combativeness, destructiveness, or piety, and that the size of these areas could be measured by feeling the skull. Doctors in asylums often took phrenological readings of patients, convinced that misshapen skulls explained criminality or madness. A protruding forehead might indicate genius. A flattened crown could signal moral deficiency. Though we now know phrenology to be pure pseudoscience, it was widely accepted in Victorian society, and its influence shaped how alienists judged their patients. The obsession with skulls also connected with craniometry, where calipers and measuring tapes were used to compare the heads of the sane, the insane, and the criminal. These measurements were then used to argue for racial hierarchies, eugenics, and the idea that madness was stamped into the body itself. Patients became specimens, their skulls measured and recorded, often without their consent, in pursuit of theories that justified prejudice more than they advanced science. At the same time, real science was inching forward. Advances in neurology slowly began to shed light on the brain's role in mental illness. Doctors experimented with dissection, studying the brains of deceased patients to look for abnormalities. They mapped nerve pathways, speculated about electrical currents, and debated whether insanity was seated in the brain's physical tissue or in some intangible mind beyond biology. This uncertainty led to strange hybrids of science and spirituality. Some doctors claimed insanity was evidence of a broken soul, others that it was a purely physical defect, no different from a broken limb. The truth, elusive as it was, gave them license to experiment with treatments ranging from the mechanical, restraints, baths, to the metaphysical, prayer, moral instruction. Victorian alienists were particularly fixated on women. Female patients were disproportionately diagnosed with hysteria, a catch-all term rooted in the ancient belief that the womb wandered through the body, causing madness. Women who defied social norms, whether by rejecting marriage, expressing sexuality, or simply being outspoken, were vulnerable to commitment. Doctors argued that women's nervous systems were more delicate, making them prone to breakdowns. Menstruation, pregnancy, and menopause were all described as risk factors for insanity. Treatment often meant confinement, sedation, or even gynecological surgery. A woman who resisted was labelled insane. A compliant, docile woman was praised as recovering. This gendered pseudoscience not only filled asylums with women, but also reinforced Victorian ideals of femininity. Women were expected to be quiet, obedient, and submissive. Those who were not could easily be pathologized as mad. Alienists wielded immense power. Their diagnoses could condemn a person to years behind asylum walls. A declaration of madness could strip someone of property, marriage rights, or freedom. Courts often deferred to alienists, treating them as authorities on the mind's hidden workings. For some doctors, this was an opportunity for genuine advocacy. A few argued passionately against harsh treatments, pushing for more humane care and understanding. But others exploited their position, building careers and reputations on sensational cases, and reinforcing society's fears that madness was everywhere, lurking in ordinary people. The theories of Victorian alienists reveal both the ambition and the arrogance of the age. Their ideas mixed genuine curiosity with superstition, prejudice, and flawed science. They sought to classify, measure, and control the human mind, often reducing people to skull shapes or moral categories. In the Asylum, pseudoscience wasn't just theory, it was destiny. If you were unfortunate enough to step through the iron gates of a Victorian asylum, the life awaiting you inside would feel at once regimented and disorienting. By the late 19th century, many asylums were overwhelmed. Facilities designed for a few hundred patients held thousands. Beds spilled into hallways, patients slept on straw in corners, and attendants were stretched thin. In such conditions, treatment gave way to containment. The asylum became a warehouse of human suffering, its original vision of cure drowned by sheer numbers. In overcrowded wards, violence was common. Patients lashed out at each other or at staff. Attendants, often poorly trained, relied on force to maintain order. Deaths from neglect, malnutrition, or abuse were hushed up, but whispered among surviving patients. For patients, survival meant adapting to the rules of asylum life. Those who complied, worked, and remained quiet might earn relative freedom, occasional walks outside, lighter supervision, or even a chance at discharge. But for others, especially those whose illnesses left them restless or defiant, life was a cycle of punishment, sedation, and despair. Diaries and letters from patients who managed to smuggle them out describe a world of monotony and terror. The endless repetition of days blurred together, the lack of privacy eroded dignity, and the sense of being forgotten by the outside world deepened despair. While lobotomies became infamous in the early 20th century, the seeds of surgical psychiatry were planted in the Victorian era. Some alienists began speculating that madness was rooted in physical abnormalities of the brain. Autopsies on deceased patients often revealed tumours, lesions, or irregularities, fueling the belief that cutting or probing could cure insanity. Early experiments included trepanation, drilling holes into the skull, or crude brain surgeries, though these were rare and often deadly. More common were surgical treatments aimed at controlling behaviour indirectly. For women, this could mean the removal of reproductive organs under the belief that hysteria and madness originated in the womb. Such procedures, often performed without consent, reflect the deep gender biases in Victorian medicine. Religious sermons were prescribed as cures for blasphemous thoughts. Patients who displayed sexual impulses might be shamed, isolated, or forced into confession. Doctors insisted that moral weakness lay at the heart of insanity, and thus cures involved moulding the patient back into a socially acceptable form. For many, this meant years of indoctrination, where even small deviations from Victorian morality were labelled as proof of illness. The story of Victorian asylums doesn't end with the closing of their gates. Their influence lingers in medicine, in culture, and in the way society continues to wrestle with mental health. To understand their legacy is to confront both the progress they inspired and the wounds they left behind. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many asylums had grown into sprawling complexes that were effectively small cities. But with growth came failure. Overcrowding became epidemic. Buildings designed for hundreds now housed thousands. The dream of peaceful retreats gave way to grim warehouses of human suffering. Reports of neglect, abuse, and high mortality rates began to surface. Reformers, journalists, and former patients began exposing conditions to the public. What had once been celebrated as triumphs of medicine were now symbols of failure. Slowly the tide turned. Calls for reform shifted the language of psychiatry from asylums to hospitals, but the problems of overcrowding and neglect persisted well into the 20th century. The Victorian asylum laid the groundwork for psychiatry as a medical discipline. Alienists became psychiatrists. Their observations, however flawed, began to map the territory of mental illness. Patterns were recognized, diagnoses formalized, and treatments slowly evolved away from purely physical interventions toward psychological approaches. Hydrotherapy, moral treatment, and sedation may now be relics, but the very idea that mental illness was a subject worthy of scientific study, worthy of its own institutions, was a lasting shift. Without the asylums, psychiatry might have remained a fringe practice, dismissed as superstition or quackery. The asylum also reshaped society's relationship to mental health. Families who once bore the full burden of caring for troubled relatives now had somewhere to send them, sometimes willingly, sometimes not. This created a sharp line between the sane public and the insane hidden away in institutions. Though it removed many from public view, it also stigmatized them further. To be admitted to an asylum was to carry a lifelong mark of shame. For some, even release didn't erase the label. The asylum system reinforced the idea that mental illness was both dangerous and permanent, a view that echoes even today. Modern psychiatric hospitals look very different from Victorian asylums, yet echoes remain. The use of restraints, sedation, and isolation, though heavily regulated today, still sparks debates reminiscent of the 19th century. The controversies around electroconvulsive therapy, psychosurgery, and the heavy reliance on psychiatric medications all trace their lineage back to Victorian attempts to control the mind and body. Equally, the dream of cure has often collided with the reality of management. Much like their Victorian predecessors, today's mental health systems wrestle with the balance between care, coercion, and control. Perhaps nowhere is the asylum's legacy more enduring than in popular culture. The towering Victorian asylum has become a symbol of fear, an archetype of haunted hospitals, sinister doctors, and forgotten patients. From horror films to Gothic novels, the asylum is a setting where order collapses and madness reigns. But beyond fiction, these cultural echoes reflect genuine history. The fear of losing autonomy, the terror of being locked away, and the uneasy recognition that madness was often defined by those in power. For all their progress, Victorian asylums cemented a stigma that lingers to this day. Mental illness is still associated with danger, confinement, and otherness. Even as modern psychiatry works toward compassion and recovery, the shadow of the asylum looms. The stories of those locked inside, of their suffering, their treatments, their survival, remind us how far we've come and how far we still have to go. So why wouldn't you last a day in a Victorian insane asylum? Because it wasn't a place of healing. It was a place where science, fear, and society collided, where treatments blurred with punishment, where lives were catalogued and controlled, and where the promise of cure often turned into a lifetime of suffering. The Victorian asylum is gone, its gates long closed, but its lessons endure, a warning about the dangers of power without compassion, and a reminder that how we treat the most vulnerable reveals who we truly are.